Newsnight with Victoria Derbyshire.
The Prime Minister says tax cuts are coming. When? How might that affect you? And will it mean the overall tax burden is going to come down in the short term or not? This Parliament has seen the biggest tax burden in peacetime. Rishi Sunak claims he's a low-tax Tory. So when will he put our money where his mouth is?
And amid all this talk about tax cuts, are we in danger of ignoring something else? Big implied reductions in spending on our public services.
We'll speak to a Conservative MP and a trade unionist. Also tonight, do today's revelations from Sir Patrick Vallance at the COVID inquiry bury the idea that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were following the science at all times?
We will pay you to go into an environment with people from other households and mix in an indoor environment, and that is a completely opposite public health message.
Joe Biden turned 81 today. He's the oldest president in American history. Is he too old to run again? This congressman challenging him for the Democratic nomination thinks so.
President Biden is perhaps among the only moderate Democrats in the United States who can and will lose to Donald Trump in 2024.
And in Argentina, a chainsaw-wielding outsider has won their presidential election. Javier Milei has promised to introduce the dollar and blow up the central bank, which he says is responsible for inflation of 143%. Now in power, can he actually do all that? Good evening. Over time, we can and we will cut taxes. That's what Rishi Sunak said in a speech on the economy in London today. Does he mean what he says? The Chancellor will deliver the autumn statement on Wednesday. Today, the Prime Minister said he believed in cutting taxes carefully and sustainably. So what does that tell us about when tax cuts are coming? And will what they announced this week actually see the overall tax burden coming down in the short to medium term? Labour, for its part, says it's happy to fight the next election on the economy. In a moment, we'll bring together Kate Bell, Assistant General Secretary from the Trades Union Congress, and Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood. First, here's Ben.
We're being primed to expect tax cuts in Wednesday's autumn statement. Here's what the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said today.
So now that inflation is halved and our growth is stronger, meaning revenues are higher, we can begin the next phase and turn our attention to cutting tax.
Now, we don't know which taxes will be cut by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. There's been lots of speculation about business taxes, inheritance tax, national insurance and so on. But let's take a step back and put all of this in context. We've shown you this chart before, but it's important. It shows that this is currently on track to be the biggest tax-raising parliament since the Second World War, raising overall tax receipts as a share of national income by around 4%. That's equivalent to around £3,500 per household on average. This is a result of tax rises already implemented, such as hikes in corporation tax and through freezing income tax thresholds. Any tax cuts this Wednesday or even in next year's pre-election budget will not significantly change this picture. But tax cuts will have a distributional effect. Speculation is swirling about a possible 1% cut in the basic rate of income tax. There's some important context here. This income tax cut would cost around £5 billion in foregone revenues. So who would benefit? One might assume that cutting the basic rate of income tax would primarily benefit those who are on relatively modest incomes. But research by the IPPR think tank shows around half of the cash benefit of this would in fact go to the top fifth of households by income, shown in red, and just 25% to the bottom three-fifths, shown in dark blue, green and yellow. But public finance experts stress there's another crucial bit of context for this discussion about tax cuts, which is the implications for public services. It's true inflation is pulling in more money in tax, but it's also imposing more pressure on public services, who need to pay staff more and buy more expensive equipment. The Chancellor had already penciled in very tight spending settlements for UK public services after the current spending review period ends in 2025, and now they look even tighter. This shows the implied path for overall day-to-day public service spending per head of population in real terms, actually a 5% cut by 2028 on current levels. But let's assume that the high political profile departments like health and education continue to be protected from real terms cuts and so see funding grow by 1%. Look what that implies for unprotected departments like justice, prisons, the police, local government, etc. A cut of 16% in real terms from today. And as the Resolution Foundation points out, this would be a pace of cuts comparable to those imposed by George Osborne after 2010.
For government departments like households, higher inflation means that just the things that they're spending on get more expensive. Those are cuts at the sort of pace that we saw back in the George Osborne 2010s era. So some really significant squeezes on government spending as a result of the inflation we've seen over the past few years.
The debate about tax cuts is based on the assumption that fiscal headroom is now providing the tools for the Chancellor and the government to deliver them. But most analysts, looking at the outlook for the economy and the current condition of the public services and the growing demands on them, are sceptical of that, to put it mildly.
Ben Chu, Nick's here, and obviously the Prime Minister is hoping this will shift the dial.
Yes, very much so, because it is a government that has been rather feeling sorry for itself. You had Rishi Sunak's conference speech. That was a big message of change after 30 years of failure. That didn't really take off, so he brought back one of the symbols of that status quo, David Cameron. Then there was the King's speech, a feeling in government that rather fell flat. So the autumn statement, they want it to be a big moment, and they now believe it can be a big moment. And the reason why they think that is they think the stars are now beginning to align for two reasons. One, they think they've got some better than expected fiscal headroom. That is a bit of extra cash. And last week they did meet their target of halving inflation. So from the Prime Minister today, as we heard from Ben, talking about cutting taxes, but doing so carefully and sustainably. So he's going to act with caution. Only cut taxes if it doesn't fuel inflation. And talking to a very close ally of Rishi Sunak, this person is saying that anything that the Chancellor does must look like that it's part of a long-term plan, and there must be a big drive to boost economic growth, boost business in this. But the government really does need this big moment because there aren't that many big set-piece moments between now and the general election. Just the budget, really, and a few more. And then we'll have the election.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's speak now to Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood from the One Nation group of Tory MPs who are described as being on the left of the Conservative Party, and Assistant General Secretary Kate Bell of the Trades Union Congress. Welcome both of you. Thank you very much for being here. Tobias Ellwood, even if a tax cut is announced on Wednesday, the overall tax burden will still be the highest it has been in peacetime, in all likelihood. So Rishi Sunak's actions don't really match his words, do they?
It's always interesting when you talk about the tax burden in the last decade or so, but you need to place that into context because firstly, the financial package that we inherited was not good. If you remember that note saying that there's no money left.
That was 13 years ago.
No, I'm adding all these up. I haven't finished yet.
Okay.
And then, of course,
you're going to go back to after the Second World War, are you? Because this is the highest tax burden in peacetime. Let me finish and
we'll get there. I'm not going back that far. I'm simply making it clear that just over the last decade, we've not only had a bad situation to start with, we've then had obviously the COVID, we've then had the Ukraine war, Brexit. The COVID itself was £300 billion that we weren't expecting to spend. And of course, that adds up. But what we're seeing now, a year ago, inflation was at, 11.1%? It's now down to 4.4%. It's moving in the right direction. And what we heard from the Prime Minister today was absolutely we want to introduce tax cuts, but we've got to do it responsibly. And you had Jeremy Hunt at the CBI today as well saying productivity needs to improve. We're not as good as Germany and places like that, but we're good at innovating. So what can Britain be? We can be a high-tech superpower. We can be another Silicon Valley. Look at what we thrive in, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, creative industries. So when you talk about tax cuts, just to complete the story here, I hope that we're going to see them giving opportunities for business to invest, to say, if a business pours more money in for more employers, more kits, more equipment, and so on, you'll get a tax break to invest. That's what will help grow the economy.
Kate Bell, presumably you would welcome a tax cut for people?
Well, what we've got to look at is what's happening to living standards. And I think most people who've suffered 13 years of real wages falling, you're about 15 grand a year worse off than you would be if real wages had grown at the rate they were growing before the financial crisis, may welcome a tax cut, but they're not going to see that reversing that decades-long decline in living standards. I think what they're also going to be looking out for is what is this overall package doing to our public services? We have got record waiting lists in the NHS, 7.7 million people waiting for NHS appointments. I think what people are going to be looking for on Wednesday is this a plan to fix our public services? Is it a plan to improve my living standards? And is it a plan to raise economic growth, which is, of course, at the foundation of that?
Isn't it just a fact that, broadly speaking, people feel less well off than maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 13 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a very, very difficult period, but not just in this country, in other countries as well. But we're actually
But isn't that what people vote on when it comes to a general election? Do they feel better off?
Just to finish, we are now growing faster than Germany, for example. Going back to that inflation number...
Honestly, growth this year is flatlined. I mean, it may be more than Germany.
And will be next year.
Goodness me.
Let's remember,
it's tiny.
If I may, that places it into context. This is actually, we are subject to global headwinds that have affected our economy.
Why does that console people?
Sorry?
Why does that console people?
It's not that it's consoling people, it's placing into context. What will hopefully help people is where we're going ahead, the fact that inflation has come down. Going back to the trade unions and so forth, they've been demanding public sector pay increases because inflation has been so high. The fact it's now been reduced back down to more modest levels, and we've still got more to do, does help meet those pay standards and allow, again, further investment into our public services. But you're right, it's been very, very difficult indeed. We need to now move to the next phase of what the Prime Minister wants to do, which is to see an advanced growth. I don't think we're going to see huge tax cuts tomorrow. On Wednesday, we're more likely to see progress, if the economy continues to improve, them being announced in the spring budget.
How does it allow further investment in public services when Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are penciling in cuts of around 16% to departments that aren't protected?
Well, at the moment, the budgets had been set because they've been tied in with the increase in pay, which is connected to inflation. But we'll have to wait till Wednesday to be able to see exactly what's going on.
But they've already scheduled
these. Every single MP, to make it very clear, is very conscious of the state of our health service, the pressure that it's been under, not least from COVID as well, wanting to see greater investment in our NHS.
OK, I'll come back to my question, but I need to bring in Kate Bell. So they have factored in, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have factored in cuts for non-protected departments of around 16% for after the next election. Courts, police, prisons, etc. 16%. Broad consensus that some of these areas are really stretched, if not on their knees. Keir Starmer has said repeatedly that money for public services would come through growth. If Labour win the next election, they are going to face a choice immediately, sticking with the Conservative spending limits, i.e. cuts of 16%, or raising taxes to give that money to those departments, aren't they?
Well, look, we want a plan for growth, and that is absolutely important, as the Labour Party have set out, and we need that plan. We've seen some of the planks of that plan from the Labour Party, whether that's that green investment strategy.
Even if you have a plan, it's going to take some time. I'm asking immediately after the next election, if Labour have won, are they going to raise taxes or are they going to stick with Conservative spending limits?
Well, that's a question for the Labour Party. What the trade union movement wants to see is that plan to invest in our public services, because that, after all, is critical in delivering better economic growth. If you think about the problems we've had with inactivity over the course of this year, the last 2 years, that's so linked to the problems in our health service. And I think what we want to see is all politicians from whichever party recognising that fundamental issue, that you can't have a strongly growing economy without strong public services, and we want a plan to get our public services back on track.
Can I just come back onto that point about comparing what Labour want to do? They've said that they're going to adopt Conservative plans. I think they actually want to neutralise the issue of the economy in the next general election.
They've said they want to fight the economy on the election on the economy.
They're hoping that the general public will say, oh, look, we are competent with the economy. We're going to take up the Conservative spending plans. But then that actually in an approach that neutralises us, that we don't talk about it, but that disguises what they might be doing. The very question that you posed as to whether they will raise taxes themselves. And there is this level of 2 few at £28 billion that has been spoken of, that they will then need to borrow in order to make ends meet and to meet spending requirements. And that is the challenge that we face.
No,
so this won't
it's not to make ends meet, it's to invest.
It's
borrow to invest.
Clearly, it's an investment plan.
No, the way we're interpreting it at the moment is the fact that they don't want us to discuss the economy. I think what you're going to see...
Rachel Reeves said tonight to the party, again, to the Labour Party again, we're happy to fight the next election on the economy. Can I just...
Right, and I think this is what happened last time with Tony Blair,
please
that when he then came in...
28 billion is to invest. Yes, you accept that?
Well, if you're speaking on behalf of the Labour Party, I'm concerned that what we're saying is that... But where's that money going to come from, 28 billion?
They're going to borrow it.
Right, exactly, that's what we're trying to say.
To invest.
Right, but anybody can then say that.
You said it was to make ends meet.
No, I'm saying that they are making it very, very clear that they're going to... what they want to spell out as if they're copying the Conservative policies, when actually they've already made it clear they're going to have to borrow at least 28 billion.
Yeah, that's right, they've said that. Let me ask you this. Rishi Sunak has tried to shift the dial in the last few months. His net zero speech, his conference speech where he claimed he was the change candidate, the King's speech. What can you remember from that?
Well, I think, take this all as a whole.
No, what can you remember from the King's speech?
A commitment to make sure that we move forward on our CO2 emissions, and a commitment to make sure that we continue our levelling up programme as well.
Was that in the King's speech?
Sorry?
Were they in the King's speech?
Yes, we can go back to it if you like.
Okay.
The point I'm trying to say is that there is now a plan that we've moved forward, getting that inflation down. There's also statecraft has returned to number 10 as well, which is helpful. We had the Food Security Summit today. We had the AI Summit as well. We're playing a role on the international stage.
Why do you think the polls aren't shifting?
Sorry?
Why do you think the polls aren't shifting?
The polls won't shift immediately because for the very reasons we're discussing, until people actually see the benefits of these in their pay and in public services and so forth, and in where Britain is going, and have confidence back in where the Conservative Party is taking us. Okay. So we will hear, I think, some impressive announcements on Wednesday, but don't expect the polls to change the very next day. It will take time for that to manifest itself and for the people to see the difference, the choice between what the Conservatives are offering and what Labour is.
Thank you very much. We must leave it there, but thank you both very much for coming in. Thank you. We appreciate it. One of the key players during the pandemic, the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, gave evidence to the COVID public inquiry today. According to him, Dominic Cummings had said, Rishi thinks just let people die. According to him, scientists didn't know about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme in the pandemic until it was announced, a scheme that, as you know, was Mr Sunak's idea when he was Chancellor. According to him, the then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said things that weren't true. In a moment, we'll ask, as the technical lead of a civil service team who came up with the UK's coronavirus dashboard, if he is learning anything from this public inquiry that would better equip the UK to deal with any pandemic in the future. First, here's Nick.
The trio who defined those dark days.
Good afternoon.
Politician, medic and scientist.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
This week, it's the turn of the experts to have their say.
I think I'm right in saying that the Prime Minister at the time gave up science when he was 15. And I think he'd be the first to admit it wasn't his forte, and that he did struggle with some of the concepts, and we did need to repeat them often.
Right here at the height of the pandemic, two pretty obscure figures became two of the most famous faces in the land. In number 10 at the time, they used to talk about how Chris Whitty was visible. Everything he said struck home with people, and so he was used in the ads. Patrick Vallance, well, they used to say that he was invisible, a figure who spoke with great authority, but instantly forgettable. Not anymore. And today we heard Sir Patrick Vallance say how scientists often had to work doubly hard to ensure unpalatable advice was heeded by politicians. He told us our advice was not loved. Boris Johnson will be giving evidence in due course. Rishi Sunak appeared to be no fan of the scientists. Vallance wrote that in a meeting in July 2020, the then Chancellor said it's all about handling the scientists, not the virus. After this remark, Boris Johnson blustered when he realised scientists were present. And a diary entry by Sir Patrick Vallance quoted the former number 10 advisor, Dominic Cummings, as saying that Rishi Sunak thought it was OK just to let people die. Vallance also accepted that the then Chancellor's Eat Out to Help Out scheme led to a higher death rate. Number 10 said it cannot comment while a statutory inquiry is ongoing.
All that expertise across government that was wasted and wasn't being used by Number 10 because it was a small cabal of people with a very insular kind of campaigning mentality.
An advocate for government transparency says the response to the pandemic was complicated by a Downing Street more accustomed to campaigning.
It's hard not to believe that perhaps it was influenced by, you'd had 2016, the Brexit campaign, then you'd had a leadership campaign. That same group of people also then campaigned to win an election. So they were a campaigning team. They were a very insular group of people and thought everything could be fixed with comms and slogans and controlling the message. And really that was just not enough when you had to be sophisticated about explaining uncertainty, preparing ministers and the population for the fact that the advice would change.
This is one of my favourites.
Eat Out to Help Out. A Chancellor subsidising restaurants at the height of the pandemic. And today we learnt that policy was introduced without reference to Patrick Vallance. Raised eyebrows at that from a Whitehall watcher.
So the thing that really surprised me coming out of this was that Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty seemingly had no input to Eat Out to Help Out before it was announced. You know, how did the Treasury get away with that? That seems remarkable that you could make such a big intervention in the economy, whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, without advice from your chief medic and chief scientist.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Three figures who dominated all our lives. And tomorrow, it's the turn of Professor Sir Chris Whitty to take the stand.
Let's speak now to the man described as revolutionising the government's response to COVID, Pouria Hadjibagheri. He was the technical lead of a civil service team who came up with the UK's coronavirus dashboard, data that was made available to us all. Thank you for being with us this evening. What did you make of what Sir Patrick Vallance had to say today?
I mean, most of his talk was quite close to my thoughts, really. I agreed with the majority of what he said. Some of which really particularly hit close to home. For instance, he raised the reprimand matter.
He was reprimanded by a senior civil servant, or the top civil servant in the health department.
Exactly, yes. And that really is quite familiar to me in the sense that I often found that it was quite difficult to communicate matters and advice directly to stakeholders or senior stakeholders. There were quite a number of layers between scientists and decision makers and ministers, and was quite proper during normal times. This could make things more difficult when it comes to an emergency response, and the reason for that is because you have a scientist trying to provide advice, and then these layers are not all scientists. They don't have a scientific background, STEM background, which means that the advice might get convoluted. And on the other hand, the minister or the decision maker is also not able to scrutinise the advice that's provided. Were
you censured or reprimanded for speaking up or speaking out?
Not necessarily censored, but eyebrows were raised a number of times. A number of times I was excluded from certain invitations, let's say. Mainly because I was quite well known to speak my mind and be very frank and provide very frank and direct advice to people.
Were you surprised to hear that, according to Sir Patrick Vallance, scientists didn't know about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme until it was announced?
I'm not. I'm not really surprised because I think that is a very common attitude in government. I don't think they always necessarily ask for scientific advice when it comes to policy making.
Really?
Of course.
Because we were told almost every day in those press conferences that they were following the science.
I mean, they're following the science in the sense that they thought they were following the science, and of course the science that was given to them directly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they came to scientists asking, okay, what do you think about this specific policy? Now, if people like Sir Patrick were not asked, about things like this, and this is quite literally their job, then you can't really expect scientists from within the department to have been asked.
Sure. From what you're hearing at this inquiry, is it the right kind of questioning? Are you hearing quality evidence that will help make the UK a better place, better equipped to deal with any future pandemic?
I find some of it quite useful, but it's quite difficult to make that judgment at this point. Partly because I think sometimes we get too much into very detailed micro issues, such as, who said what when, and, what was said in a private conversation between two people in the corridors or in a WhatsApp message. That is not really the kind of policy that was translated into macro level policy. And I think focusing too much on that takes away from more important issues, macro policies that had quite an extensive impact on people's daily lives.
You also felt, I think, that there was quite a bit of duplication. And this is relevant particularly to your COVID dashboard, not yours, the team that you led, which was praised. It gave all of us real-time data that we could all look at, we could all understand, and which, according to one commentator, transformed the debate around the virus. Tell us about what you thought was duplication, and then let me ask you why you think that approach hasn't been rolled out to other departments in government when it comes to the use of data.
In terms of duplication, I think a lot of duplicative work was done across different departments in the government. With respect specifically to the COVID dashboard, we had the official coronavirus dashboard provided by the UK government, which was the one that I worked on. Then we had the Office for National Statistics dashboard, who provided data that was not exactly similar to what we did, but what we provided included ONS data as well later on. Then the NHS also created a dashboard which provided whatever data that the NHS had, which we also had. But this type of duplication causes delays, and it's not really, in my opinion, the best use of resources. That doesn't mean that each of these organizations didn't do a great job. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that they were not entitled to do what they did. What I'm saying is that we could utilize our resources more. We could be smarter.
Yes.
In the utilization of these resources. And
is this a public sector cultural issue? I mean, do you work in the private sector now?
I do, yes.
Have you seen duplication in the private sector?
I have, yes.
Right. Okay. So what is the issue then?
I think it's more of a cultural issue in a sense. I think.
What, with just people?
It's just people, yes, and they don't really see this duplication as a duplication.
They think they're doing something different / better.
They do, yes, and also it also kind of sort of creates a competitive spirit amongst different organisations, which might be useful in the private sector, but it's not necessarily useful and productive in the public sector.
Why hasn't your dashboard model been used in education or the Justice Department?
That's a very good question.
What's the answer?
The answer should really be given by decision makers. We created something bespoke that didn't really exist before that. We created not only, I think sometimes we are at the risk of learning the wrong lessons. The COVID dashboard wasn't something that looked nice. It was an infrastructure that was created based on extensive work and research over a period of time, and it improved iteratively. And I was contacted during the pandemic by different departments to adopt it, but it never really came to fruition. Yeah. Yes, but I think we could adopt it for a lot of different things and prevent that type of duplication of work again.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening on Newsnight. Thank you
for having me.
The United States President Joe Biden turned 81 today. As he seeks to run the White House for another 4 years, it's a milestone likely to draw attention to his status as the oldest person to ever occupy the Oval Office. Some opinion polls show Americans worry he's too old to run again for the top job. 74% of people said Mr. Biden would be too old to serve a second term, compared to 50% for Mr. Trump, according to a recent ABC Washington Post poll. A Yahoo YouGov poll found that 54% of Americans say Mr. Biden no longer has the competence to carry out the job of president up from 41% before the 2020 election. Donald Trump, the frontrunner for the Republican nomination to challenge Biden in the 2024 election, is 77. Here's Joe.
The birthday boy has long been guilty of gaffes.
Harder than getting a ticket to the Renaissance tour or Britney's tour. She's down in, it's kind of warm in Brazil right now.
The latest, today confusing Taylor Swift with Britney and Beyonce.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he...
After last week labelling China's president a dictator during a visit to the US, prompting this reaction from his Secretary of State. In recent years, President Biden has fallen and seemed confused.
Representative Jackie, are you here? Where's Jackie?
Here calling out for a congresswoman who had died in a car crash the previous month.
Is this the best path?
Now a key Obama-era advisor has raised doubts.
There's just a lot of concern about the age issue, and that is something that I think he needs to ponder. Just do a check and say, is this the right thing to do?
I'm Dean Phillips, and I'm running for President of the United States of America.
And one Democratic congressman has launched a long-shot challenge, and he's careful with his criticism of Joe Biden. What is your message to President Biden?
My message is thank you. My message is deep respect and gratitude for a career serving this nation, but it's time for change. And I would say, Mr. President, you can cement your legacy of being the very bridge that you promised, the transitional presidency that you promised. You did your job. You effected great change. You saved this country. You did it with grace and character and competency. But I would ask that you not risk that legacy for yourself and not risk a legacy for the United States of America that I'm afraid is cementing itself with each passing day by losing to Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
But that very candidacy has angered other Democrats.
Dean Phillips needs to sit back. Dean Phillips needs to understand that he has no base. There isn't a clamoring of American voters who are pushing Dean Phillips to run at all. Most people didn't even know who he was. President Biden has time and time again showcased how uninformed the polls are. He's beat them over and over again. We saw it in the primaries and the last primaries that basically had him dead in the water before the first two primary states even actually voted. We've seen it time and time again throughout his political career, and Joe Biden's a fighter.
Earlier this month, the New York Times and Siena College polled voters in 6 battleground states: Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Donald Trump won in 5 of those states and outside the margin of error, while Joe Biden narrowly won the 6th. Meanwhile, the same research suggested the proportion of voters in swing states who think Donald Trump is too old to be president has more than doubled. But the increase is even starker for Joe Biden. Almost 3/4 of voters surveyed argued his age is a problem.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Advancing age has been an area of attack before, but it's not one Donald Trump has taken advantage of. Because he's 77.
Right here. They thought Bush, because Bush supposedly was a military person. Great. You know what? He was a military. He got us into the Middle East. How did that work out, right?
And has recently confused Jeb Bush for George W. Bush and President Xi of China with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Next year looks likely to be a head-to-head between the oldest presidential candidates in history, and 2 particularly unpopular ones.
There's a big risk with keeping Biden, but I think there's a big risk in dumping him too. So that's the difficult thing for Democrats. And I would say the same thing about Republicans, that for all of Trump's problems, it's not obvious that another Republican could build the same kind of political coalition that Trump has built and maintain everyone in that coalition.
A focus on abortion and Donald Trump's supposed threat to democracy has helped Democrats to recent election success. But will that playbook work again? It was last Thanksgiving that Joe Biden agreed with his family he'd run for a second term. This holiday season, some in Washington are wondering if he's now at risk of becoming an electoral turkey.
Joe Pike. Meanwhile, there's been what's been described as a political earthquake in Argentina, where the people have elected a far-right outsider, Javier Milei, as their new president. Mr. Milei has promised drastic changes, which include ditching the local currency for the US dollar and blowing up the central bank in order to prevent it from printing more money, which he argues is driving inflation. Inflation there, by the way, is 143%. Javier Milei calls himself a libertarian and anarcho-capitalist who wants to slash the state and blow up the central bank. To his opponents, the former media pundit and tantric sex guru is El Loco, the madman. His brash style and radical right-wing policies echo those of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, who said Mr. Milei would make Argentina great again. Mr. Milei is also a political outsider who rose to fame on television. He promises to do away with what he sees as a failing political caste dominated by the Peronist party of his opponent.
Stop this impoverishing model of the caste. Today we embrace the libertarian model so as to return to being a global power.
With Argentina's economy in perennial crisis, widespread poverty and inflation at more than 140%, an unexpectedly large majority of Argentines sided with Mr. Milei, a trained and unorthodox economist. Mr. Milei's radical proposals include slashing government spending by up to 15% as a share of the economy, closing the government's culture, women, health and education ministries, and privatising most state-owned companies. Perhaps the centrepiece is the plan to introduce the US dollar as the national currency to replace the Argentine peso in a bid to control inflation.
¡Viva la libertad, carajo! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
The president-elect wants to loosen gun laws, abolish abortion, which was legalised in Argentina in 2020, and allow the trade of human organs. Will he get his agenda through? Many economists say dollarisation, untried by a country of Argentina's size, will be tough because the central bank doesn't hold enough dollars and won't be able to borrow because it's defaulted on its debt. And the political numbers appear to be against Mr. Milei. His Freedom Advances coalition, founded just a couple of years ago, will hold fewer than 1 in 6 seats in the lower house of Congress and 1/10 of the seats in the Senate. So he'll have to negotiate support from the main centre-right coalition, whose leaders he clashed with before they backed him in the runoff. But the president-elect has a big personal mandate for change. Let's talk to Dr. Christopher Sabatini, who is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. That's the Foreign Affairs think tank. Also professor at LSE, professor in public policy in Latin America. Welcome to you. Can he do all that he promised the electorate?
It's doubtful. For a number of reasons. First of all, as your report said very correctly, he doesn't have a majority in Congress. He only has 7 senators, his party. He only has about 38 in the 257-seat Chamber of Deputies, no provincial governors. But the second point is also he really just lacks the temperament of negotiation and compromise. He's not a politician. That was his calling card. That was what attracted him to the majority of voters who were angry and fed up with the system. But he really doesn't have the temperament. Someone who waves around a chainsaw probably isn't going to be too keen on negotiating. But last, he's never really spelled out how he's going to take these very drastic and radical policies. How will he implement dollarization? How will he slash the budget? How will he reduce the number of ministries by about half? We don't know. And so consequently, it's unclear, but we don't know who's on his team to help advise him. It looks pretty much like it's him. And by most accounts, he really doesn't have a very deep bench, and he doesn't have a lot of friends even.
OK. If he can't deliver some of those really radical promises, what does that mean for the people who voted for him? What does that mean for democracy?
It's a good question. I think most people who voted for him didn't really vote for his program per se. They hadn't really thought through the dollarization. They were trying to throw a brick through the window of the Argentine political class. For example, the Peronist party, that's the sitting party right now, has governed for the 16 of the last 20 years. In that time, there's been a boom, a dramatic boom, but then a bust. And during that time, inflation rose steadily. Poverty rose up to 40%, and inflation, as your very good introductory report mentioned, is at 140%. So consequently, people didn't really care what he stood for so much, or the actual details of the program. They just wanted someone different. They wanted someone who was proposing something very different. So we don't know. I mean, I think there'll be a certain element of commitment to him as almost cult-like figure, but I think most people just didn't really know what they were voting for in terms of the economic consequences of what he's proposing.
Donald Trump welcomed his election. He said he's going to make Argentina great again. Are there similarities between Mr. Milei and Mr. Trump?
Oh, very much so. And it doesn't just start at the hair. First of all, they very much are develop sort of a political reputation based on division, polarization, trying to drain the swamp, as Trump used to say about Washington, D.C. They're very similar, and they also seem to have a very similar distaste for the negotiation and bargaining of politicians. Milei, last night in his victory speech, said that the political caste is over with, it's done with. It's very much an idea of us, the outsiders, and those disenfranchised against an elite. And that's very much sort of Trump's calling card.
In terms of dollarizing the country, I mean, in practical terms, he simply can't, can he? Because the central bank does not have the reserves of dollars. That's just a practical thing, yes?
There's a number of problems with this. Again, it sounds nice. And we can understand why people were attracted to it. The Argentine government, for decades now, has made a habit of overspending and then covering those spending shortfalls by printing more money, and that's what contributed to the inflation. So the idea of sort of dollarizing and hitching your economy to a more stable currency makes sense. There are a number of problems with that. First of all, as you say, Victoria, there aren't enough dollars in the central bank. Second, there's going to be huge speculation on the peso, which will plunge the rate of the peso, the value of the peso, when it comes time to turn in those dollars. But there's also the issue of, does the Argentine economy, an economy of over 600 billion GDP, want to hitch its economy to the United States, where, let's be honest, it's in such a state of political dysfunction, the U.S. can't even now pass its own budget.
Sure.
It is a really losing gamble.
They have got an economy that's growing, though, which is,
true,
compared to some of the Eurozone, is amazing compared to what's happening here. I feel like we could talk for hours more, but I'm afraid that's the end of the programme. But thank you so much for coming in and speaking to our audience. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thank you. That's all from us tonight. I'm back tomorrow. See you then.
Hello there, good evening. Well, it's been quite a mixed day of weather today. Windy in the west, some brightness